Katerina Jakob watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jakob saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. This is the episode for December 9th, 2021. Our first topic tonight, the war in Ukraine, NATO expansion drives conflict with Russia. This actually comes from 3 articles, Aaron Maté from Grayzone, and then an article from the, what's it called? Oh, hell. Well, another one from the, Liberation News from the Party of Socialism and Liberation, and a third one, I can't remember where it comes from, but anyway, first on the list, Russia is seeking a legally binding pledge that NATO will stop expanding east, including to Ukraine. If the US refuses, is war next? Richard Sakwa joins pushback with Aaron Maté, that's from Grayzone. Russia is seeking a legally binding pledge that NATO will stop expanding east, including to Ukraine. If the US refuses, is war next? That's the question. Scholar and author Richard Sakwa analyzes the growing Russia-Ukraine threat and how Russiagate fueled it. This episode of Frontline, we'll have it for you. The video of it in a link below this video. I want to point out that when Gorbachev was negotiating with NATO and with the American empire way back in the 90s, to remove U.S. troops from Germany. Russian troops from Germany, and to end the Cold War. The United States and NATO gave Russia an ironclad promise that they would not move NATO anywhere further east towards the Russian borders. As we know, and as history shows, that the Americans lied, NATO lied. They've taken several countries in Eastern Europe and put them under NATO, and they move nuclear weapons and offensive weapons closer and closer to the point where now we've got the biggest military buildup on the Russian border by an enemy. In this case, the enemy is NATO and the American Empire and the UK. Since Operation Barbarossa in 1941 under Hitler. So the Russians have a lot to be worried about. NATO aggression increases risk of war in Eastern Europe. And this part is by Liberation News from the Party of Liberation and Party of Socialism and Liberation. They say diplomatic relations between Russia and the United States continue to slip and are edging towards a crisis. On Wednesday, that's Wednesday last week, not this week. It's Wednesday the 1st, I believe, 1st of December. Russia ordered some U.S. embassy staff in Moscow to leave the country by January 31st in retaliation for the expulsion of Russian diplomats from Washington last weekend. And that means the weekend before last, not last weekend. Both embassies had already been operating at limited capacity. The mutual expulsions come on the heels of a meeting taking place in Latvia of foreign ministers of countries that are part of NATO, of the NATO military alliance. A topic for discussion at the meeting is the buildup of Russian military forces on the border with Ukraine. And note that that is on the border of Russia, on Russia's border with Ukraine. In other words, Russian military forces are in Russia, and that's what the United States is griping about. Russian forces are in Russia. The increased Russian troop presence follows increased naval and aerial drills by NATO forces in the Black Sea. NATO's unplanned drills were so extensive and serious that Russia called off scheduled military drills on November 12th so as not to escalate the situation. Putin called the drills a serious challenge for us. Nuclear-capable B-52 strategic bombers were some of the planes that took part in the NATO drills. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was the most recent voice added to the chorus condemning Russia's troop movements. Blinken threatened to implement a series of unspecified sanctions against Russia should they attack Ukraine. Blinken and the NATO alliance never, however, have not gone so far as to allow Ukraine to become a member state, which would entail a commitment to go to war if Ukraine is attacked. Even if it was the result of a provocation. If NATO does take this highly provocative step, it would be viewed as a severe crisis by Russia. And the third part of this point is Putin. Ukraine is to Russia what Cuba was to America in the 1963 Cuban Missile Crisis. And I believe this one is from Workers' World Party. History shows that agreements with the US are virtually worthless. In an almost universally ignored speech by Putin on December 1st, titled Ceremony for Presenting Foreign Ambassadors Letters of Credence, he said, merely as an aside, and I shall add clarifications in brackets, by the way, the threat, and this is Putin talking, by the way, the threat on our western border, he was referring mainly to Ukraine, is really growing, and we have mentioned it many times. It is enough to see how close NATO military infrastructure has moved to the Russian borders. This is more than serious for us. He meant that it is an existential threat against Russia, just as the Soviet Union's placement of nuclear weapons in Cuba would have been an existential threat to America in 1963. But he always tries to be non-alarmist because his real audience regarding such matters is the people who control US foreign policies, and he doesn't want to draw the public's attention to matters of existential consequence between the superpowers. Anyway, back to Putin. In this situation, we are taking appropriate military technical measures. But I repeat, we are not threatening anyone, and it is at the very least irresponsible to accuse us of this, given the real state of affairs. This would mean laying the blame at the wrong door, as the Russian saying goes. In my speech at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I already stressed the priority facing Russian diplomacy at this juncture is to try to ensure that Russia is granted reliable and long-term security guarantees, those guarantees which NATO and America are not giving them. While engaging in dialogue with the United States and its allies, we will insist on the elaboration of concrete agreements that would rule out any further eastward expansion of NATO and the deployment of weapons systems posing a threat to us in close proximity to Russia's territory. We suggest that substantive talks on this topic should be started. I would like to note in particular that we need precisely legal, juridical guarantees because our Western colleagues have failed to deliver on verbal commitments they made. And that's referring back to the commitments by NATO and then President, I think it was George Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, I believe at that time, commitments that they would not move in to Eastern Europe, which they did. So specifically, anyone is aware of the assurances, everyone is aware of the assurances they gave verbally that NATO would not expand to the east, but they did absolutely and opposite in reality, absolutely the opposite in reality. In effect, Russia's legitimate security concerns were ignored, and they continued to be ignored in the same manner even now. So what are your thoughts, Rainer?
Wow, there's so much scapegoating going on, both towards Russia and towards Belarus. There's this narrative that's coming from the fascist government in Poland and is amplified by liberals the world over about how Russia and Belarus are to blame for the current migrant crisis. And it's pretty reprehensible how the Poland's regime and the Ukrainian fascist regime, I'm guessing, have been pointing the finger like this, because I recently saw a story about how Ukrainian forces have been shooting at Belarusian migrants at the border. So that's another facet to this humanitarian crisis caused by U.S. sanctions on Belarus that also involves the humanitarian crisis which NATO has created throughout the last 7 years in Ukraine, where they've manufactured this proxy war that's displaced all of these people. And Russia has primarily been taking on the responsibility of taking in these refugees. Now Russia is getting blamed. So all that they're doing is pointing the finger, scapegoating, and at the same time facilitating horrific abuses of the most vulnerable people in this situation.
Yeah, definitely. Topic number 2 tonight: defenders of abortion rights rally as Supreme Court hears arguments. In this latest Supreme Court case, the right of women to access to abortion and the ability of states to deny that access is threatened. And a lot of people are very worried about it. This is comes to us also from the Party of Socialism and Liberation from December 3rd. On December 1st, the U.S. Supreme Court heard oral arguments in Mississippi in the Mississippi case Dobbs versus Jackson, Women's Health Organization, to evaluate whether state laws that ban pre-viability abortions are unconstitutional. The Supreme Court's agreement to review the Mississippi 15-week abortion ban unquestionably threatens nearly 50 years of Supreme Court precedent and is a test case to overturn Roe versus Wade. Around the U.S. advocates for reproductive justice rallied in cities. Let me start that over again. Around the U.S., advocates for reproductive justice rallied in cities large and small in support of fundamental rights to abortion care. Liberation News was there, they say. In Washington, D.C., 2 rallies, one right after another, converged outside the U.S. Supreme Court to demand that women be able to control their own bodies, futures, and lives, including access to safe, affordable abortion health care. Hundreds of supporters throughout the day came to support women's rights, hearing from many inspiring speakers who had benefited from abortion care. The message was clear. Women are fighting back and will not sit back as a political body of unelected and unaccountable life-term political figures discuss their basic rights and needs. The Bay Area branch of the PSL held a speak out in the heart of downtown San Francisco on the evening of December 1st. Demonstrations were also held in the Bay Area, San Diego, San Jose, Manhattan, New Hampshire, Cincinnati, Boston, Seattle, and Jackson, Mississippi, among others. So there you have it.
It's an issue that's seemed to have been here forever in the United States, but apparently has only taken on such an intense role during the last 50 years, like during the Reagan era and so forth, when the Republicans suddenly made abortion into pretty much their main issue, their biggest issue. And I think I will, as for the people who claim that they're being opposed to abortion is proof that they're in the right. It reminds me a lot of the so-called trans exclusionary reactionary feminists, people who take this stance, and that's actually pretty harmful and is obviously reactionary, and they act like they're doing it out of desire to further humanity, further a social cause. And they probably do believe that, but it's a harmful stance. And I'm glad for this update on the opposition to that stance.
Yeah. This is really, I mean, you know, in 1972, the Supreme Court passed Roe versus Wade. And since then, abortion has been a right in America, all across America. Now, there's a lot of talk from the Republicans, and a lot of threats, but until now, I don't believe there's ever been such a real threat to a significant part of Roe v. Wade. So this is a little bit, well, no, it's not a little bit. I shouldn't equivocate like that. It's a hell of a lot different than anything else we've seen since the early 1970s. This is a real severe attack. So we hope for the best, but you know, America's definitely going in a fascist direction. So this kind of a fascist move would not surprise me at all. We'll see. We'll see how it goes in the end. We'll have to keep our eye on it, and see where the Supreme Court lands on it. Because I mean, this is 9 people who have dictatorial powers over the courts, and they're appointed for life. And the, you know, short of impeachment, there's really nothing anyone can do to stop these people. So we'll see how it lands. Topic number 3: Imperial decline and climate crisis will cripple the U.S. military. Rainer Shea.
Last month, this military expert, or I think it was some sort of military insider, said that the U.S. military is not prepared for the impacts of global warming, and they cited the imminent shortage in lithium. Apparently, in the coming decades, much of the U.S. military's global supply of trucks, in particular vehicles, are going to run out of lithium batteries. And they then they said that what worries them is not just global warming, how this is apparently going to make these resources, these kinds of resources more scarce, or perhaps more in demand for the military's operations. But also they said China has been garnering ever greater control over the global lithium supply. And I think that's really symptomatic of the decline of U.S. imperialism. There's a tangible way that Washington's geopolitical collapse has come to put Washington in a tight spot in terms of its military resources. In this last year alone, Washington's former neo-colony Bolivia has broken free from imperial control, and now Washington can no longer exploit that lithium. And appropriately, Bolivia, the new Bolivian socialist government, has been making lithium deals with China. So the imperialists are getting increasingly cut off from the resources they need to subjugate the world, and the great toll that America's, USA's role as the core of imperialism has taken on its internal economic structure, on its internal living standards, is really going to bite back at the US empire when global warming impacts the country in the ways that it will in the coming decades. Look at what's happened with the pandemic these last couple of years. The US has had the most pandemic deaths because of its role as the core of imperialism, because of the severe austerity policies that its extreme military budget has created. The people in this country are so ill-equipped to handle a disaster. Think of how severe that disaster is going to be, how severe these humanitarian effects are going to be when global warming impacts the country in the ways that the Pentagon expects it to. And 2 years ago, the Pentagon came out with a report speculating about how U.S. armed forces are going to have to be used in U.S. borders to increasingly manage these internal humanitarian crises, manage the people who've been internally displaced, not just by storms, but by what the Pentagon expects to be a general collapse in the U.S. electrical grid. So that's something to look forward to. I expect all of these factors: imperial decline, the collapse of the economy, global warming, the collapse of the infrastructure that neoliberalism has built, because the electrical infrastructure in this country especially is very weak due to neoliberal austerity. All of these factors are going to converge to put the military in a tight spot.
And you said how they have built. I'm thinking, no, the problem is that they haven't built.
They haven't built.
They haven't built. I mean, the infrastructure. I'll be talking about that in the next topic. But the infrastructure is just incredibly behind, like 50 years behind in some places. We have crumbling bridges, and the Civil Engineers Society has come out with performance reports on the U.S. Infrastructure every year for decades, giving the U.S. like a D+ rating on infrastructure, essentially a third world rating on infrastructure. And the government doesn't do anything about it because the government is run by Wall Street. The government is run by the capitalist ruling class, the billionaires. And for some reason, they don't think they need this. They need a modern infrastructure that would support a modern industrial society. We're not post-industrial. You hear the liberals say post-industrial all the time. We're becoming pre-industrial, not even industrial in many, many ways. And there are simply industries that can no longer function in the world market on a fair basis because they don't have the infrastructure that they absolutely need. So Yeah, imperial decline, that's the word right there. I mean, you know, you start your title of this article off with that, with imperial decline. And that's what this is all about. These are leading indicators of imperial decline. Next on the list, global supply chain crisis, capitalism, militarism, and infrastructure by Betsey Piette from Workers' World Party, December 3rd, 2021. And in this article, Betsey goes on to say here, if we can get to it, multiple issues confront the US capitalist economy during the continuing COVID-19 pandemic. Of major impact is the global supply chain crisis, which has exposed long existing problems with the capitalist system. During the last 40 years, corporations have maximized profits by globalization, moving production abroad for the lowest wages. Now, big business is coming up against big problems in moving goods produced abroad into and through the US, where workers are increasingly unwilling, to labor under unsafe conditions for insubstantial pay. Maritime workers are refusing to spend months confined in cargo ships with limited safety precautions and unable to visit their families. There is a shortage of transport workers willing to drive trucks for low pay, long hours, and under unsafe conditions to move goods from ports. The trucking industry faces an annual 90% plus turnover. Underlying the situation is a decades-long reluctance of capitalist politicians to fund domestic infrastructure improvements necessary to keep up with the demands of global production. Meanwhile, wars abroad have been funded eagerly. According to Costs of War, over one half of the federal government's total assets, buildings, aircraft, ships, vehicles, computers, weapons, benefit the military. The Pentagon's total assets increased in value from 1.1 trillion in 2000 to 1.8 trillion in 2019. Military spending is currently 3.4% of the US GDP, while combined federal, state, and local spending on infrastructure is only 2.3%. In comparison, China's infrastructure spending was 10 times higher than the US in 2018. Concerns over inadequate infrastructure funding and the impact on the US economy surfaced over 15 years ago. In 2005, the Congress created the National Surface Transportation Policy and Review Study Commission to evaluate transportation conditions, which were determined insufficient to meet rising demand for trade and goods movement. In 2008, findings the commission recommended, in its 2008 findings, the commission recommended a substantial national commitment to transportation investment of at least $225 billion annually from all sources for the next 50 years. Accounting for inflation today, it would require spending $4.3 trillion to catch up to that proposed investment. This allocation never happened. In November, Congress approved President Joe Biden's infrastructure bill that contained a meager 1.2 trillion investment over 10 years. Only 115 billion is designated for roads, bridges, and other transportation projects. 115 billion. 130 billion of the bill will go to transit systems to benefit parcel delivery industries like Amazon, FedEx, and UPS, adding to the volume of vehicles using the same antiquated highway system.
You know, another thing to note about the consequences of the USA's role as the center of global imperialism is how big of an impact Washington has had in relative terms on the climate. U.S. military is the largest institutional producer of petroleum, and more broadly, the U.S. empire's global interventions are the main thing that prop up the global capitalist regimes. Pretty much all of the world would probably be socialist now if Washington had allowed for Latin America to go socialist in this last century, if it had allowed for Africa and the rest of Asia to go socialist. We might not even be talking about this shit if the U.S. military were not in existence, and as a consequence, the climate has been damaged in incalculable ways. So now that's going to come bite back at the U.S. empire when the climate hits this really deficient infrastructure.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, next on the list, gang fascism. How capital weaponizes the social ills it creates. Rainer Shea.
I've been reading some really interesting theory that I wish I had read years ago, because it's dispelled the illusion that gangs in this country especially are somehow ripe for becoming vessels for revolution. Marx, I think it was Marx who wrote that the lumpen proletariat can be brought into the fold of revolution, but their conditions can also prepare them well for roles as agents of what he called reactionary intrigue. What does reactionary intrigue mean when it comes to gang members? It means the story that I tell in my article about this Chicano mobster here in California from the 70s who made an alliance with the Black Panthers. He made an alliance with Global South liberation movements. He was trying to unite the California gangs of both the Chicano and African nations in a decolonial communist movement. And pretty quickly, he was betrayed by his fellow gang members, and he was set up to be killed. His alliance was totally shattered. It actually turned into a 31-year cycle of tit-for-tat killings between these two gangs, and he was stabbed to death in prison. That's how easy it is for attempts to reform the gangs in this country into revolutionary entities to be sabotaged. And this is symptomatic of what Marx and Engels talked about when they warned about working with the lumpen proletariat. By the lumpen proletariat, they had a different definition, apparently, from the definition of lumpen we often use today. They were talking about the facets of the lumpen who are directly involved in these kinds of reactionary entities, the mafiosos, as opposed to the definition we use today, which seems to encompass pretty much everybody who's been pushed out of the role of the proletariat.
Yeah, well, of course, things are a lot different 150 years ago in Europe than they are today in North America. That said, first of all, the lumpen proletariat today is a much larger category than it was 150 years ago.
Yeah.
150 years ago, they were basically the criminal element. They were pushed off to the side of society, lived in the underbelly of society. Today, vast swaths of what used to be the working class are lumpen proletariat, simply because they've been pushed into that. Now, what does this mean? Everything that Marx and Engels said about the lumpen proletariat is really just pretty useful today. The lumpen proletariat can become an agent for reaction. They can become weapons of reaction, or they can become revolutionary. I would say it's incumbent on revolutionary political parties to pay attention to working with and educating the lumpen proletariat for that very reason. I can guarantee you that our enemy class will be doing that and is doing that. Our enemy class is in there one way or another. They have agents within the lumpen proletariat actively attempting to pull the lumpen proletariat into their fascist mobilization. So, I mean, it's an issue where we don't have a crystal ball that can tell us which way it'll go. In reality, there'll probably be gangs that go one way and gangs that go another way, depending on a lot of local factors, a lot of cultural factors that are unique to their own specific geography. So that's my thought on it anyway. Last but not least, U.S. Olympic boycott politically driven. This is from Xinhua news agency in China, the communist news agency in China. Beijing, this is from December 7th. Based on groundless allegations, once again targeting China's Xinjiang province, the White House has reportedly confirmed that it will stage a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics. Washington's latest attempt to politicize the forthcoming global sports event runs counter to the Olympic spirit that intends to unite rather than divide. This blatant political provocation will also risk damaging Sino-US relations, one of the world's most important bilateral relationships that stands at a crucial crossroads. Given that no US officials had been invited to attend the Beijing Winter Olympics, the so-called diplomatic boycott is no more than a self-invented and politically convenient excuse for Washington. Such a move, based on lies and political hostility, will not stand in the way of the Olympic Games, but only be remembered as a move by some politicians who put their self-interests before the pursuit of peace and unity of humanity. It is a long-held consensus of the international sports community that boycotts are the most ominous ghost in the Olympic movement. At a time when unity is needed above all else, Such a boycott will not only cripple and disrupt global solidarity, but also serve as a fatuous gesture. It will ultimately hurt the interests of the athletes who are expected to be the real protagonists of the games. It is not the first time that the United States has targeted Xinjiang, an autonomous region covering about 1/6 of China's landmass, with fabricated accusations of forced labor or genocide. By spreading fallacies and turning a blind eye to the progress in the world's second largest economy, the United States weaponizes human rights with a political motive. By launching a diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games, the United States is using Xinjiang related issues to sow discord among various ethnic groups in China. It was with the goal of fostering peace and brotherhood and fair athletic competition that the creators of the modern Olympics founded the Games. Any attempt to use the Olympics as a place to advance political agendas is in violation of the Olympic Charter. A successful Games should be one where athletes, not politicians or news organizations, take center stage. The U.S. diplomatic boycott will do nothing but hurt the interests of its own athletes.
It sounds like the U.S. is pretty much alone in boycotting the Olympics, and that's something to note because all of Washington's allies have obviously gone along with the narrative about the Uyghur genocide, but it's the U.S. that's seemingly the most willing to alienate other powers, and that's kind of an illustration of what we've been talking about when it comes to the U.S. imperialism isolating itself, cutting itself off from the rest of the world, to the consequence that it hurts its own interests. It's stubbornness.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how. I mean, we've got some time before I think the Olympics begin in February, so we've got a couple months left before things actually come about. So I don't know where Washington's most loyal toadies will land on this issue, but we will see. We will see what we shall see. And we'll be keeping you apprised of how this idiotic boycott goes. I think that the point that China makes, which is that these people weren't invited anyway. So what are they boycotting? They're boycotting something that they weren't invited to. So, you know, they weren't going to be there. No diplomats there. Anyway, that's it for us for tonight, unless you have anything else to add. No. Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank you, Rainer, for your yeoman's efforts in bringing us the articles you bring us and bringing us the analysis that you lend to the show. And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for tuning in. Please come again next week when we'll have another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. Until then, I bid you a sweet adieu.